Science College, B. So I want to thank the organizers for this. The topic is such a vast topic that I was at loss. That how shall I, somebody who is a student of literature, should actually try to give a key to opening these so many locks that are lying in front of me. Right? Nation and narrations, inquiries into history, politics, society, culture, literature, and democracy. Such a huge topic, a challenging topic, and so many locks. So and this is organized on, I think, 75th anniversary of Indian independence. And I was invited for a similar talk by another organization to speak on Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. And I was at loss for the topic, and this is how I started asking myself questions about independence. What does it even mean to us in 2022? As the world reels back slowly from the pandemic. And we are staring at a world war, a rogue state like Russia, who does not seem to give in to international community, cannot be kept in check by international community. In such a situation, what do these things even mean? Questions of nation and narration, inquiries into history, politics, society, culture, literature, and democracy. So I began by invoking the very person that Dr. Dalveer Singh Gehlot invoked. So did Jamie Colbert invoked Mahatma Gandhi. And Gandhi is one of the keys to these many laws. So as a keynote speaker, I am going to use Gandhi as a key and try to open up these questions rather than giving a final answer to these vast problems. And one of the themes of my topic today is language, and language which should not be taken at face value. Duplicity of language. So even if you look at the title of this seminar, Inquiries into History, and Professor Dore has already mentioned about inquiry as a state or committee inquiry or a police inquiry, as Dr. Dalveer moved. That is one form of inquiry. The other form of inquiry is the philosophical one, going back to Plato or the Upanishads. Third type of inquiry is where you try to find out information. So words don't seem to have a stable meaning, and they carry their own baggage with them. That is one of the themes that I'm going to pursue. And a philosopher who has highlighted this extensively in his analysis of contemporary political situation in 21st century, Jacques Derrida. Now, many of you may be aware of the name of Derrida because he's often prescribed at masters as somebody associated with deconstruction. But Derrida's later writings of 80s, mid-80s onwards, especially after the collapse of Soviet Union in 1989, turned to more explicitly political themes. And one of his very famous books is Politics of Friendship, where he tried to redefine what is meant by political in the first place after the collapse of Soviet Union, because politics was defined in Cold War period in a certain way. And after the Cold War, in a unipolar or no polar or the world of polar bears, like Putin, what do we mean by political? What is the ideological agenda that these things carry? Is one of the questions that has persisted in his writings. And when I started thinking of Gandhi and Derrida together, and they belong to a very different domain. Gandhi, as all of us know, and Gandhi as no one knows. Because Gandhi is a person who everybody knows and nobody really knows. That's why the maximum number of biographies in the world would be on Gandhi. There is no shortage of books on Gandhi because everybody thinks that they know about Gandhi, but they don't. Gandhi is a field of discourse rather than a human being with expanding number of books. So one question that I began by asking myself is what would Gandhi say to pandemic? coronavirus pandemic, what would he have said? And I was going through Hind Swaraj, where he's criticizing Western civilization and industrialism, and he's saying that trains may serve a good purpose, but because of trains, plague would spread 100 times faster. Technology of communication is good, but bad news will spread faster than good news. And this is what he's saying in Hind Swaraj, 1907, 1910, 110 years before WhatsApp started ruling over the world. So in the era of post-truth, probably, as Professor Dore had brought up, Gandhi has something to say. Because Satya is one of the cornerstones of his thought. And when we say Gandhian thought, we should always remind ourselves that Gandhi himself did not make a distinction between thinking, doing and being. For him, thinking and doing and being are coextensive. And that's why Gandhi wrote substantially. At the same time, his actions defined who he was. Several major satyagrahas, which I think Professor Dr. Dalbir Singh would have talked about had he got more time, are well known. We study them in our schools. But what did he say which is still relevant to us? And is Gandhi relevant to us? Then some people will say affirmatively yes, but if you look in the public domain outside, Gandhi has vanished except from our notes and some advertisements, state advertisements. So which Gandhi are we talking about? There were many Gandhis, and that is one of the points that I would like to talk about. Which are those many Gandhis? In the process, I am not making a case for post-structuralist or post-modern Gandhi, because that is also one of the titles of the book that I found, Post-Modern Gandhi. That is not what I am talking about. I am trying to understand Gandhi's thoughts and its relevance to 2022 in the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, in the light of Derrida's thought. So what I am going to do is I am going to look at how there are many Gandhis. There is no one Gandhi today. And for that I am going to evoke a very famous book by Jacques Derrida called Spectres of Marx, where he talks about the relevance of Marx after the collapse of Soviet Union. And in that he evokes the ghost of Hamlet's father and Hamlet. Time is out of joint. I'm sure many of you might have heard of this. But Derrida is using this play as a point of entry into the whole question of legacies of people as seminal as Marx, and in our case as Gandhi. And he goes on to say the whole idea of life and death, right? The binaries of life and death are built into our thinking, especially the Western thought, and they are underwritten by metaphysics of presence, which causes one to be privileged over another. We privilege life over death. We privilege man over woman. We privilege white over dark. We privilege light over darkness. Right? And so one of the tasks of deconstruction is to reverse, subvert these binaries and to show that there are two interpretations possible, which are what he calls aporias. So Derrida's one of the tasks is to analyze the question of democracy and show the aporias. By aporia you mean two contradictory interpretations which cannot be reconciled. And he points out that even if you go back to the very word demos and kratos, going back to Plato and Aristotle's time, there is a contradiction there. One contradiction is between freedom and equality. Right? Do you have freedom? Can person have absolute freedom to take away somebody's freedom? Right? So then, if democracy is about increasing freedom, then do you have freedom to take away somebody's freedom. And the other thing is equality. Do we need equality wherein you take away somebody's freedom? So equality and freedom are binaries, and they always cause a kind of conflict within the very idea of democracy, wherever it has been. So it has always been possible that people have said, let us protect democracy and take away democracy. Right? It happened in 1975. It is happening all the time. Right? You are suppressing democracy in order to save it. And he also talks about the question of numbers, which is central to democracy, and it was discussed today that we have very few audience. Right? So the number does matter in democracy, because at the end of the day, when the EVM machines are taken away, it's the number that matters. So does majority mean that democracy is for the majority, by the majority, of the majority? Or does democracy mean equality of rights and freedom for everyone, irrespective of whether that person is from minority or majority? And I'm also thinking of sexual minorities, I'm also talking of caste minorities and gender minorities. So majoritarianism is very often used to suppress minorities, but that is done with the agenda of saving democracy. And that is built into the paradigm of democracy, according to Derrida, going back to Plato and Aristotle's time. So there is a problem with the very notion of democracy. However, democracy, according to Derrida, is democracy to come. And that is one of the important themes of his writing. Not democracy as we have it today. Democracy not as defined in past, but democracy to come. And that connects to his very famous thesis of difference, where he combines differ and defer. Those who are aware of Derridian philosophy may know something of this. That the meaning of any word cannot be fixed. It is always deferred and deferred. So democracy is never ever present. At the same time, we have to fight tooth and nail for a different democracy than we already have. So the fight for democracy can happen only within the horizon of democracy to come, which means today's democracy, or democracy even in 1945, is always already inadequate because of the contradictory structure there. So what I did was to look at Gandhi's ideas of democracy, and they are extremely harsh, and I'll just read out some of them. In fact, we don't have much time, because I would have discussed many Gandhis and how there are 4 types of Gandhi according to Ashish Nandy, who have lived afterlives of Gandhi. I have also written about Gandhi, the Gandhi everyone loves to hate. Everybody hates Gandhi, but a particular Gandhi. There is always another Gandhi which you like. So once you have decided which Gandhi you like, you are free to choose which Gandhi you hate. That is what Vinay Lal has discussed. But again, I am skipping because of lack of time. Because my focus is going to be on the question of democracy. Can I have some water? And his notion of Ramrajya. Now, given the present ideological climate or weather, let's hope it's weather and not climate, is Ramrajya would have entirely different meaning. But what is the sense in which Gandhi himself used it is also something that I am looking at what Gandhi has to say. So in Hind Swaraj on parliamentary democracy, this is 1907 or 6. right? That is almost 116 years ago. Right? He is saying that the model of democracy that England is using is like a sterile woman and prostitute. Now these are very harsh words, and the book obviously was banned. And this question of censorship is also central to democracy and the freedom of expression, and where Gandhi is making a case for freedom of expression all the time. And it has become a burning issue today. Probably it was always a burning issue. It was always a burning issue. But now with the digital public sphere, which is no longer print public sphere, but digital public sphere of social media and Twitters, I think the whole question of freedom of speech has taken a new dimension. And which independence are you talking about when probably one of the best cricketers today, his daughter, newly born daughter, gets a rape threat? Now, what kind of democracy are we talking? What would have Gandhi said to this? I'm not sure. But why does he call it sterile woman and a prostitute? Is because he says that people elect handful of people to run this country, but they are only interested in their own welfare. They are selfish. They only want to make money, and they just go there to sleep. These are the words he is using. He is talking about democracy in 1907, 40 years before independence. And he says parliament is without master. And he then talks about prime minister. He says prime minister is more concerned about his power, I am quoting Gandhi, than the welfare of the parliament. His energy is concentrated upon securing the success of his party. His care is not always that parliament shall do right. Prime ministers are known to have made parliament do things merely for party advantage. This is 1907 Hind Swaraj. I can have nothing against prime ministers, but what I have seen leads me to think that they cannot be considered patriotic just because they are prime ministers. They cannot be patriotic. If you become prime minister, you are not patriot, according to Gandhi. So if you have problems to that, I think you should write to Gandhi. If they are considered honest, because they do not take what are generally known as bribes, this is Gandhi again, let them be so considered, but they are open to subtler influences. In order to gain their ends, they certainly bribe people with honors. I do not hesitate to say that they have neither real honesty nor a living conscience. And then he talks about media, something that Doesser evoked. For the English voters, their newspapers are their Bibles. And today you can see there are certain channels which have become our Bibles. They take their cue from their newspapers, which are often dishonest. The same fact is differently interpreted by different newspapers according to their party in whose interest they are edited. So I think we have to think again about journalism if Hind Swaraj is to be believed. Yeah. And you will find all this on a website called mkgandhi.org and Hind Swaraj chapter 5, Condition of England. Then he becomes extremely harsh towards democracy. Gandhi dislikes democracy. He prefers what he calls enlightened anarchy to democracy, and this is well known. And he says that in the manners of conscience, majority has no place. Let us not push to mandate theory to ridiculous extremes and become slaves to resolutions of majorities. That would be a revival to brute force in a more virulent form. If rights of minorities are to be respected, the majorities must tolerate and respect their opinion and action. It will be the duty of the majority to see that the minorities receive proper hearing and are not otherwise exposed to insults. And we have heard of a novel in which a woman is slapped because of saying something on Facebook. So democracy in the West, according to Gandhi, and that is the democracy we have adopted, he says is not real democracy. It is only so-called democracy. It has germs in it, certainly of the true type, but it can come when all violence is eschewed. True democracy can arrive, the democracy to come, can arrive only when violence is eschewed. And that is the fundamental principle that Gandhi follows. And malpractices disappear. Two cannot go hand in hand. If India is to evolve the true type, there should not be any compromise with violence or untruth. Now these are the words which he uses in Hind Swaraj again. So Gandhi's critique of democracy is primarily that it is not real democracy. Because it's based on violence, self-interest of the few, it does not really transfer power to everyone. And his ideal, obviously we are aware, is Sarvodaya, when the last person in the queue is free. Then we have achieved true freedom. So it goes against his ideal of Sarvodaya. And then he goes on to define Swaraj. And he says that if we want Swaraj, we don't want, he says, we want English rule without the Englishmen. You want tiger's nature but not the tiger. That is to say, you want to make India English. And when it becomes English, it will not be Hindustan, but Englistan. This is not the Swaraj I want. Because this democracy, Western democracy, is based on violence, deceit and corruption, cannot be real democracy. And we cannot adopt this. My Swaraj is to keep the intact of a genius of our civilization. I want to write many new things, but they must be all written on Indian slate. I would gladly borrow from the West when I return the amount with decent interest. And he borrows the word Swaraj from, in his own view, from Vedic word, and he gives it a twist, which Tilak did not. We are aware of the word Swaraj in Maratha history, how it was called Hindvi Swaraj also later on. And we are talking of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj and the establishment of Swaraj. But for Gandhi, Swaraj is not rule over our land, which Tilak is talking about, which is your birthright. For Gandhi, Swaraj is Raj over oneself. Because all of us have corruption and sin and everything within us, real Swaraj can come only when we have rule over ourselves. Swa ke uppar Raj, Swaraj. And that is what will lead to Ramrajya, according to him. So Swaraj is the way through which you reach Ramrajya. So I will just read what he means by Ramrajya. By political independence, I do not mean an imitation to the British House of Commons, or the Soviet rule of Russia, or the fascist rule of Italy, or the Nazi rule of Germany. They have systems suited to their genius. We must have ours suited to ours. What can be is more than I can tell. I have described it as Ramrajya, sovereignty of the people based on pure moral authority. Swaraj will lead to Ramraj. By Ramraj, I do not mean Hindu Raj. I mean by Ramraj, divine Raj, the kingdom of heaven, a phrase from Bible. For me, Ram and Rahim are one and the same deity. I acknowledge no other God but one God of truth and righteousness. Whether Ram of my imagination ever lived or not on this earth, opposition to socialists and others consists in attacking violence as a means of effective any lasting reforms. And Gandhi was one of the persons who was not really secular, because he insisted that real politics, or if we are trying to define political in 20th century, has to be based on spiritualism and religion. You cannot have a godless politics, according to him. But what religion is he talking about? He is saying that I am not thinking of Hindu or Mohammedan or Zoroastrian religion, but that religion which underlies all religions. That is his position. We are turning away from God in Swaraj. And he believes that freedom struggle that we are talking about cannot be about individual. And this is, I think, Gandhi's profound move, that you cannot achieve salvation alone. A trader who has earned his wealth by deception only succeeding in deceiving himself. This can be washed away by spending some amount of his ill-gotten gains on so-called religious purposes. Gandhi's views on capitalism are also very interesting, but we don't have time for that. And he also talks about how various religions are all true and use of one true religion. And because all pass through human medium, they are always imperfect. So he is not in favor of any one religion. Everybody is right from his point of view, but it is not impossible that these values existed everywhere. Freedom, equality, liberty,